wheels would be categorized as a 0-4-0 wheel arrangement. A locomotive with a 4-wheel leading truck, followed by 6 drive wheels, and a 2-wheel trailing truck, would be classed as a 4-6-2. Different arrangements were given names which usually reflect the first usage of the arrangement. For instance, the Santa Fe type 2-10-2 is so called because the first examples were built for the Atchison, Topeka and Santa Fe Railway. These names were informally given and varied according to region and even politics. The UIC classification is used mostly in European countries apart from the United Kingdom. It designates consecutive pairs of wheels, informally axles, with a number for non-driving wheels and a capital letter for driving wheels, A equals 1, B equals 2, etc. So a white 4-6-2 designation would be an equivalent to a 2C1 UIC designation. On many railroads, locomotives were organized into classes. These broadly represented locomotives which could be substituted for each other in service, but most commonly a class represented a single design. As a rule, classes were assigned some sort of code, generally based on the wheel arrangement. Classes also commonly acquired nicknames, such as Pug, as mal-shunting locomotive, representing notable, and sometimes uncomplimentary, features of the locomotive's 66, 67, performance. Measurement. In the steam locomotive era, 2 measures of locomotive performance were generally applied. At first, locomotives were rated by tractive effort, defined as the average force developed during one revolution of the driving wheels at the railhead. 35. This can be roughly calculated by multiplying the total piston area by 85% of the boiler pressure, a rule of thumb reflecting the slightly lower pressure in the steam chest above the cylinder, and dividing by the ratio of the driver diameter over the piston stroke. However, the precise formula is where D is the bore of the cylinder, diameter, in inches. S is the cylinder stroke, in inches. P is boiler pressure in pounds per square inch. D is the diameter of the driving wheel in inches. And C is a factor that depends on the effective cutoff. 68. In the US, C is usually set at 0.85. But lower on engines that have maximum cutoff limited to 50-75%. The tractive effort is only the average force, as not all effort is constant during the one revolution of the drivers. At some points of the cycle, only one piston is exerting turning moment, and at other points, both pistons are working. Not all boilers deliver full power at starting, and the tractive effort also decreases as the rotating speed increases. 35. Tractive effort is a measure of the heaviest load a locomotive can start or haul at very low speed over the ruling grade in adjuvant territory. 35. However, as the pressure grew to run faster goods and heavier passenger trains, tractive effort was seen to be an inadequate measure of performance because it did not take into account speed. Therefore, in the 20th century, locomotives began to be rated by power output. A variety of calculations and formulas were applied, but in general railways used dynamometer cars to measure tractive force at speed in actual road testing. British railway companies have been reluctant to disclose figures for drawbar horsepower and have usually relied on continuous tractive effort instead. Relation to wheel arrangement. Classification is indirectly connected to locomotive performance. Given adequate proportions of the rest of the locomotive, power output is determined by the size of the fire, and for a bituminous coal-fueled locomotive, this is determined by the grate area. Modern non-compound locomotives are typically able to produce about 40 drawbar horsepower per square foot off grate. Tractive force, as noted earlier, is largely determined by the boiler pressure, the cylinder proportions and the size of the driving wheels. However, it is also limited by the weight on the driving wheels, termed adhesive weight, which needs to at least 4 times the tractive effort. 41. The weight of the locomotive is roughly proportional to the power output. The number of axles required is determined by the I's weight divided by the axle load limit for the trackage where the locomotive is to be used. The number of driving wheels I derived from the adhesive weight in the same manner, leaving the remaining axles to be accounted for by the leading and trailing bogies. 41. Passenger locomotives conventionally had 2-axle leading bogies for better guidance at speed. On the other hand, the vast increase in the size of the grate and firebox in the 20th century meant that a trailing bogie was called upon to provide support. In Europe, some use was made of several variants of the bissel bogie in which the swiveling movement of a single-axle truck controls the lateral displacement of the front driving axle, and in one case the second axle too. This was mostly applied to 8-coupled express and mixed traffic locomotives, and considerably improved their ability to negotiate curves whilst restricting overall locomotive wheelbase and maximizing adhesion weight. As a rule, shunting engines, U.S., switching engines, omitted leading and trailing bogies, both to maximize tractive effort available and to reduce wheelbase. Speed was unimportant, making the smallest engine, and therefore smallest fuel consumption, for the tractive effort was paramount. Driving wheels were small and usually supported the firebox as well as main section of the boiler. Banking engines, U.S., helper engines, tended to follow the principles of shunting engines except that the wheelbase limitation did not apply, so banking engines tended to have more driving wheels. In the U.S., this process eventually resulted in the mallet-type engine with its many driven wheels, and these tended to acquire leading and then trailing bogies as guidance of the engine became more of an issue. As locomotive types began to diverge in the late 19th century, freight engine designs at first emphasized tractive effort whereas those for passenger engines emphasized speed. Over time, freight locomotive size increased, and the overall number of axles increased accordingly. The leading bogie was usually a single axle, but a trailing truck was added to larger locomotives to support a larger firebox that could no longer fit between or above the driving wheels. Passenger locomotives had leading bogies with 2 axles, fewer driving axles, and very large driving wheels in order to limit the speed at which their reciprocating parts had to move. In the 1920s, the focus in the United States turned to horsepower, epitomized by the superpower concept promoted by the Lima Locomotive Works, although tractive effort was still the prime consideration after World War I. To the end of steam. Goods trains were designed to run faster, while passenger locomotives needed to pull heavier loads at speed. This was achieved by increasing the size of grate and firebox without changes to the rest of the locomotive, requiring the addition of a second axle to the trailing truck. Freight 2-8-2S became 2-8-4S while 2-10-2S became 2-10-4S. Similarly, passenger 4-6-2s became 4-6-4S. In the United States this led to a convergence on the dual-purpose 4-8-4 and the 4-6-6-4 articulated configuration, which was used for both freight and passenger service. 69. Mallet locomotives went through a similar transformation, evolving from bank engines into huge mainline locomotives with much larger fireboxes. Their driving wheels were also increased in size in order to allow faster running. Manufacture. Most manufactured classes. ISH 4444 0-10-0 at Warszawski Rail Terminal, St. Petersburg. The most manufactured single class of steam locomotive in the world is the 0-10-0 Russian locomotive class E steam locomotive with around 11,000 produced both in Russia and other countries such as Czechoslovakia, Germany, Sweden, Hungary and Poland. The Russian locomotive Class O numbered 9,129 locomotives, built between 1890 and 1928. Around 7,000 units were produced of the German DRB Class 522-10-0 Kriegslock. In Britain, 863 of the GWR 5700 class were built, and 943 of the DX class of the London and North Western Railway, including 86 engines built for the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway. 70, United Kingdom. Great Western Railway number 6833 Calcutta Grange, a 4-6-0 Grange class steam locomotive at Bristol Temple Meads Station. Note the Belpaire, square-topped, firebox. 60163 Tornado on the East Coast Main Line in 2016. Before the 1923 Grouping Act, production in the UK was mixed. The larger railway companies built locomotives in their own workshops, with the smaller ones and industrial concerns ordering them from outside builders. A large market for outside builders existed due to the home-build policy exercised by the main railway companies. An example of a pre-grouping works was the one at Melton Constable, which maintained and built some of the locomotives for the Midland and Great Northern Joint Railway. Other works included one at Boston, an early GN building, and Horwich Works. Between 1923 and 1947, the Big Four railway companies, the Great Western Railway, the London, Midland and Scottish Railway, the London and North Eastern Railway and the Southern Railway, all built most of their own locomotives, only buying locomotives from outside builders when their own works were fully occupied, or as a result of government-mandated standardization during wartime. 71. From 1948, British Railways, BR, allowed the former Big Four companies, now designated as regions, to continue to produce their own designs, but also created a range of standard locomotives which supposedly combined the best features from each region. Although a policy of dieselization was adopted in 1955, BR continued to build new steam locomotives until 1960, with the final engine being named Evening Star. 72. Some independent manufacturers produced steam locomotives for a few more years, with the last British-built industrial steam locomotive being constructed by Hunslet in 1971. Since then, a few specialized manufacturers have continued to produce small locomotives for narrow gauge and miniature railways, but as the prime market for this is the tourist and heritage railway sector, the demand for such locomotives are limited. In November 2008, a new build mainline steam locomotive, 60,100